Welcome everybody here in the room and all those fans of research on Eastern Europe online. We are happy to have you with us on this occasion of the reopening of our Leibniz Science Campus Eastern Europe Global Area here in Leipzig. Reopening means we're happy that we are going into a second phase, that this campus works. Whoever is curious about this campus is invited to visit our website, of course. Just 2 sentences. We are a network of research institutions, 3 universities in Central Europe, 6 further non-university research institutes that have decided together to promote young researchers who want to do research on Eastern Europe, who want to become experts on Eastern Europe on their way to established academicians and so on. And by that, we are happy that we are not only working together among these institutions here, but normally we would have had a regional conference of BASIs, which Matthias Neumann now is going to introduce us with a short sentence.
Yeah, very briefly. It's a real pleasure to be here in Leipzig today, and I'm really excited about the collaboration with the Leibniz Science Campus, ZOiS Berlin, as well as the DG Owen, putting together the regional conference under the theme of Eastern Europe, globalizing Eastern Europe. It was supposed, of course, to take place right now in Leipzig, and unfortunately, as a result of the COVID pandemic, we had to postpone it to April next year. And I just want to say, keep out for announcement and messages from us about the conference in due course, when we will announce how exactly the conference will take place and the circumstances we find ourselves in. And for now, I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's event, which will explore the impact of the pandemic on research in our field.
Stay tuned.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gemma Pölzken. I'm the moderator this evening, a journalist from Berlin, and I'm very happy to be here. Also, we have audience in the room, and we have audience somewhere in the world, in the internet. I heard that there are even some people from India watching us, so welcome everybody. And we will talk tonight about research under COVID-19 conditions, Eastern Europe as a global area. And I think that COVID-19 actually acted like a magnifying glass for many worldwide problems. And while they are not new, they have become more visible through the pandemic. During this evening, we will discuss what this means for research and also for academia under corona conditions. And we start with the first panel, which reflects on more general questions of this topic. And we have later a second panel, which will focus on the practical impacts. And there will be a time in the end of each panel to pose some questions here from the audience, but also we have a chat line online. And please, I will welcome every question later. And let me now introduce our 3 speakers for this first round. There's in the middle Gwendolyn Sasse. She's the director of the Center for East European International Studies, which is called ZOiS. And it's an interesting think tank founded actually in 2016 in Berlin. And she's also a professor of comparative politics in Oxford and a non-resident fellow at Carnegie Europe. Then we have there to my right, Matthias Middell. He's a professor of cultural history and the director of the Global and European Studies Institute here at the University of Leipzig. He's also a speaker of the Collaborative Research Center, 1199, and the Leipzig Research Center Global Dynamics, and also publisher of the journal Comparative. Then we have here Stefan Rohdewald. He's a Swiss historian and professor of Eastern and Southeastern European history at the University of Leipzig. He's speaker of a priority program of the German Research Foundation, DFG, which is called Transottomanica. You will tell us a little bit more later, which involves actually 10 universities and research institutions. And as I said, we have a more general discussion here, and I would be very much interested what you think, and I start perhaps with Gwendolyn, to ask you, what do you think, which are the main challenges actually for academics and for you in your research work now with COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, there are quite a few challenges, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to discuss this a bit. I think it'll all keep us busy for a long time to come. There are challenges at different levels, and there's the challenges for ongoing research that was put in place before COVID happened and is still legitimate and needs to go on, and cannot very often go on if it involves empirical data collection in various places in the world. Our second discussion, I think, this evening will focus more on that, but that's a very serious challenge, and it refers to the whole range of scientific data collection. Surveys aren't possible in the same way as before. Qualitative interviews are not possible in the way they were done before. Anthropological work on the ground is difficult or impossible right now. But at the same time, I think it's also a challenge. It makes us, in a good way, it makes us think of or question again what methods we use, in what settings, what questions we can incorporate now into ongoing research. And then, of course, there's also big questions that this pandemic makes us ask now. And in addition to all the other challenges around balancing life and work, and if you say challenges, then that includes those issues as well.
Can you make it a little bit more concrete? For example, for your institute, was a new question occurring now, or?
Yes, I think some questions are new or are being asked again. So I think if we start at a fairly conceptual level, then I think now is the time to really consider terms and concepts like the state, the nation, state-society relations. All of this, exactly as you said, we're looking through this lens now, a magnifying glass. And while maybe early on many people said, researchers and policymakers, nothing will be the same again, I'm not sure about that, but it certainly puts up things in perspective, opens up like also a lens onto processes we don't observe quite like that in normal times, if we can say it like that. So I think at some level it's really the very basic questions social science research deals with, the basic concepts. If we think about what does the global mean, this couldn't be more global, this pandemic, but at the same time responses have been very national and local, at least initially. And that also has had an effect on societal expectations and what you expect your state to do, or maybe your locality, your local government to do. So those are not new questions, but we have to ask them again. And we're seeing, I think, underlying trends being reinforced and strengthened. And we can also, with social science research, we can capture them now. And that's really the task and the challenge at hand.
Mm-hmm. Matthias, would you agree? I mean, you're very much involved into big global questions. And what do you think?
I mean, we fought bitterly until last year against the idea that there is one globalization, that is a homogeneous process, and that you can build theories about that very easily. I would call that even an ideology of globalization and a certain type of globalization that was understood by that term. And we proposed already a little bit against the river that there are different approaches to global connectedness. This Leibniz campus is another way of addressing that issue. But it was hard to fight it through the majority of social science definitions and politicians talk about globalization. And all of a sudden we realized that obviously countries, societies, states have very different approaches. The ones retire from WHO, the others insist on a global alliance for vaccination, etc. And at the same time, this story with COVID-19 was very illuminating. I would like to illustrate that with an example. think of the masks. Masks used in hospitals were pieces of 2-3 cents value produced in China until last year. Late March, it was a very rare object, and in the supermarket around the corner in my part of Leipzig, it was at 12 euros. So I asked my daughter to produce it at home. And then there was a more general debate emerging out of this experience about resilience. We should bring production back home, or at least to shorten value chains. No longer value chains to China, but bring it, let's say, to Eastern Europe. Then we have more control, etc., etc. And all of a sudden, economists surprised us with the message that this is a process happening since 2010. Nothing new. Shortening value chains and production chains is something that happened already for 10 years, being not remarked by anyone in the public debate. It needed the COVID-19 experience that we talk about what kind of model would we like to continue in the case of masks, etc. I'm not sure if we all are willing to pay the current 2 to 6 euros per mask in the future, or if we go back to Chinese production because it is so much cheaper. But we have a choice. There are alternatives. There are political decisions within the ways you globalize your own society, or you interact with other societies and their ways to globalize.
And
let's say Eastern Europe.
Which role does research play there? I mean, can it consult governments, or what is it doing actually there?
You know,
it's an interesting example, actually.
Yeah, but there was a debate in the 1990s that we enter a phase of science 2.0. And that good old Max Weber idea that science is a separate field in society from politics, from journalism, etc., would be over. I don't think so. I guess we learn again that politics depend on independent research, and independent means also that we formulate our questions and that others formulate their questions, and then we can start a dialogue. But we shouldn't only do research because someone asked the question in the political realm. Because many of these issues, let's say value chains, are long-term processes. Politics are much shorter oriented. Yeah? So I guess we have learned, and the virologists have learned that the first way, when we follow here, that you need independent research and should not mix up with journalism and political advice as if you are the politician yourself.
Stefan, what does it mean for the work you do? You are a historian, and I think this interesting priority program, you should tell us a little bit about it, Trans-Ottomanica. It's actually, from what I understood, starting from the 16th century and leading until today. And, okay, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, this was affirmative.
Now, I would be interested, I mean, how much does it have to do, I mean, such a big historic program with what we are discussing now?
Well, I would introduce with this opportunity then a little bit of a smaller focus, a spatial configuration, including Eastern Europe and the Near East in global context. And of course, there are questions today we can ask about this, but as a historian, we like to start in the 15th century or earlier. And at least we have reached now the 20th century in the second phase until the middle of the 20th century. Just we are following mobility dynamics of people, knowledge, and objects between Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, Poland, Lithuania, and the successor states until the middle of the 20th century. It's about the constituents of societies by these movements. Our thesis is that societies are formed by migration. Even if a small part migrates, the whole of society is changed to a migration society, and not only in the local or in the meaning of within the Russian Empire, but in the whole space between the Near East and Russia, For example, slave trade involved hundreds of thousands or millions of people from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, which were moved over centuries to the Mamluk states, to Persia, then to the Ottoman Empire. These are structures, these are consolidating societies. What does it mean then connected to questions we are interested in this discussion? Well, one could introduce the plague, which then shows that our focus area had a function as a hinge between other areas in a global sense, the Indian Ocean world and Western Europe, or then the Americas. To some degree, COVID-19 moved in this direction from China. There were large numbers of cases in Iran first, and then in Italy and Germany somehow simultaneously. It's difficult to see the links, but these are the known cases. It would be probably an overstretch to see here our focus area in an important role. And another approach could be that we ask, and you were asked about this, what changed the virus or what exacerbates it, this virus, which crises were changed by the virus. And if you look at political systems in this focus area in the Near East and Eastern Europe, one could say that the systems reacted as they are used to react to crises. Military regimes did what they are used to do. Egypt quite successfully reacted to some degree. Unstable regimes or the situations in the Lebanon with other factors are now near to the collapse. It's a very abstract way to approach the question, but if one then continues with Syria, hospitals were destroyed during this period with the help of the Russian army to some degree. In Belarus, there was an election campaign going on, and the acting president explicitly didn't think the virus is important and supported the victory celebrations in May. To some degree, the result of the election or the dispute about his presidency, of course, was exacerbated by this virus situation. In Russia, the government reacted more proactive to the virus, and there were some measures. Nevertheless, Navalny in April, May started a campaign to boost social support. He had a 5-point program published, and not all of his publicity, but to some degree, to some amount, his publicity was changed also by the virus. So this is just one attempt to name some examples.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think Gwendolyn and Stefan showed very well that there were a lot of crises triggered actually in the time now of Corona. And I remember very well that in the beginning, when actually we heard about the first events in China, there was an interesting discussion about which kind of system could manage COVID-19 better. And there was this thesis saying that authoritarian state could do much better than democracy. And I think we have since then seen a very different development. And I would like to ask you how you see this thesis, because you're working very much on questions like this.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. It's one of these big questions that we can think of, how are authoritarian or democratic or also in between systems reacting to the crisis, and how do they come out of it strengthened or weakened. And initially, I was actually quite surprised that also in Europe you heard this thesis a lot, or this hypothesis that authoritarian states or systems can manage better because they, I suppose is the implication, because they have control mechanisms in place, and they can very quickly sort of control situations through the executive. But actually what we've seen, and I think that was actually as logical from the beginning, to think, yes, they have control mechanisms at hand, but it's also a risk that authoritarian leaders cannot really calculate and manage, and therefore it's actually highly risky for them. And we've seen the example in Belarus, if you make the completely wrong call, you actually, it's not the only reason, but you stir up societal discontent, and in particular among also workers in the health sector, for example. So there was a local kind of organizations, health organization, and obviously anger building from below. We've seen it in Russia as well, Putin trying to delegate authority to the regions and governors and localities without the resources, but the responsibility is there. And that's an open question. It's not really, didn't look for a long time like a strategy to really show that the state is managing very well. It was rather like, can we offload responsibility and make it not so visible? So I think there's are a lot of examples that show that this is highly risky. And some authoritarian leaders have actually opened up and also accepted expertise, scientific expertise, noticing this risk. On the other hand, democratic systems also had to use their executives in ways that they don't normally use them, and power got concentrated. And we're having this discussion in Germany, which is in Europe, one of the countries, or maybe the country that has generated the most colorful, shall we say, protest movement against restrictions and so on. So it's against sort of civil liberties that are temporarily restricted. So I think we've seen discussions, but we've also seen in democratic systems, even if that happens, and some parts of society are now vocal against a temporary, at least, concentration of power and implementation of control to some extent. We also see these, what we social scientists call rally around the flag effects. So we see gravitation towards the center of politics, at least in the initial stages. Now it seems that also populism feeds off the crisis and the fears that have been stirred up. But initially the effect was also going back to what one knows best, sort of mainstream politics and the center, and trust actually in institutions and some democratic systems. But maybe if I can add to that, I think, because you asked what are also issues that are maybe fresh on our agenda now, and I know that historians have looked at this for much longer than social scientists, but for social scientists, I think now a real challenge is to take emotions and factors like fear, like also psychological predispositions seriously. And emotions are really something that during a pandemic comes up a lot, and that's really hard to factor that into research. So what that requires immediately is that I need to team up with a psychologist to then enter, for example, as I've tried now in research on Ukraine, to enter questions into surveys that might tap into this. And what we already find is actually we don't see the rally around the flag effect. We actually see less trust, for example, in this case, in the Ukrainian president, if you have these types of experiments, sociological experiments that prime people on certain psychological dispositions. And I think that is one of these examples where it makes us realize some factors that seemed maybe unnecessary to take into account when you discuss trust or capacity of states, but now it's really at the forefront, and we really need to think of ways of also pooling expertise, different disciplines, and rethink our methodological toolbox as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it has been already a trend for several years that we have more interdisciplinary cooperation, but do you think, Matthias, that this time is also a time where we have actually more need for that? Because we saw with the virus as well, there were different academics actually consulting, I mean, from nature science, but then there was a discussion in Germany, I mean, that there should be other people from social science much more involved. So do you think it's really a time to work more in teams like this?
It seems that you raised two questions. Is it necessary? Yes. Mm-hmm. Is it happening? No.
Tell us about
you
it.
just mentioned, I mean, I remember 1932, Georges Lefebvre, La Grande Peur, as the book about how the French Revolution emerged. Emotions are really not at the agenda for the first time, and I guess also not in social sciences.
Mm-hmm. But we're still not very good at actually.
But I'm only saying interdisciplinarity depends on reading each other's work, and I see a tendency. Sorry if I sound cynical, that people read only their own work, and that makes it really difficult to speak about interdisciplinarity. I mean, only to question, where does us lead this very central question of authoritarian versus democratic states to? What do we gain when only democracies will gain or win the war against the virus? and the authoritarian states are full of viruses.
Perhaps they change, who knows? I mean.
Yeah, no, but the question, of course, then we have an authoritarian COVID-19, and that will be a horrible thing. No, my point is, do we support a game that is, of course, played by the political class to distinguish systems and types of system in order to transform performance into soft power? And is that helpful in order to create a coalition for general vaccination or to collect money to create the trust that is necessary, obviously, to believe in any result of medical research, etc. So that's only one remark. I understand that this is a very central debate in political science to distinguish these types of regimes, but I ask myself, is it the time to insist on that point so much? Interdisciplinarity, I guess, is today much more of a challenge between what in the life sciences and in the social sciences or humanities is going on. Yeah, so this belief in truth in large parts of the natural and life sciences, in contrast to our permanent doubt that we have not yet the right answer because we are part of the construction process of that truth. That conflicts, and the political class is, of course, much keener to believe in someone who tells them the truth. When we come with our results, this is social interaction that may work in that or that direction, they feel a little bit stressed. Here it is not only about our willingness in the realm of research to interact, but it is a question of how do we speak to the public? And that is not very interdisciplinary, it seems to me. So I would say yes and no at the same time. Sorry for...
I think you wanted to add.
I just wanted to come back on one point. You're absolutely right, and I'm a political scientist, and political scientists, not me, but generally are obsessed with classifying systems. But
I think you need to speak louder.
What I tried to say was that actually this shows us now that, as I think you are implying, it misses a lot of the nuance, and actually what's much more, interesting, if that's the right word from a researcher's point of view, is that we see similarities in both systems in terms of responding, not responding. We see kind of shades of this, and it's no longer, it shouldn't have been anyway about really rather rigid categories, and they're not necessarily always rigid, also not in existing research, but now we see, I think, exactly kind of where some of the limits of these very rigid classifications are, and how systems can behave. Also, societies expect similar things in very different contexts. And if I can add one other sort of little bit remark to what you say, and maybe more the optimistic view on interdisciplinarity. And I'm in a research institute. I'm trying to help build it, and the goal is to become more interdisciplinary, which, as you know, is a really difficult thing. And universities are not structured in a way that anything would be conducive to interdisciplinary way. Academic careers are not usually made unless you're maybe a natural scientist of a particular kind. Then you're very popular, I think, for interdisciplinary work. It's not made on your career on interdisciplinary work. But I think at the moment, there are actually conditions in place which I think also we as researchers need to now fill, because actually natural scientists clearly have been leading and have been more visible. But I think this is the time when society at large is much more aware of, and much more than we could have ever achieved, of how research works, and how frustrating it is as well, because it doesn't generate a clear answer. And then you're going back to the drawing board and you start again. But what is also becoming obvious that historians, social scientists are also needed to now fill in what is happening with society in these situations. So I think that it's really, the onus is upon us now to also step up and try and make these links. The whole structure of research is not conducive to it, but I think this moment is, in that sense, quite a special one, and there's some potential at least to try this.
Stefan, would you agree?
I think there are several approaches and several aspects. One common topic is trust into the answers by political systems. I think this is a common problem in West and East, if we can't talk about West and East. all these systems have the same trouble to sell their answers as making sense and as being reliant on science and nevertheless constitutional. And this is a very complicated situation to find solutions and to sell them in a constitutional, legal way. You can name Italy as an example, where you have these decrees now being used, but there are questions about the legal procedures of the publicity. These decrees should have been communicated to the parliament within 48 hours or so if you are following the procedures. So in principle, all these political systems are at their limits, and they are not breaking down, but if trust is evaporating, then we are in a very interdisciplinary situation. As a historian, it has not been my job to counsel, to give advice to governments, and I think I wouldn't be pushing such a role. But I think that's a very difficult situation. I think historians are not educated to be active in such a way of trying to influence a political procedure. That this has not been our job in the last 20 years at least. And if it has been in the 19th century or in the beginning of the 20th century, it has been disastrous in effect. So there are reasons not to do it.
But historians seem often much more willing to comment on any contemporary event, much more so than social scientists. So,
as soon as we are inventing nations, the troubles are starting.
I would like to invite you for questions, please, because there's still a little time. Yes, please tell us where you are, who you are. Do we have a mic? Yeah.
I found this discussion. Does it work?
Perhaps you just say who you are.
Gabriele Freitag from the German Association for East European Studies in Berlin.
And the mic.
I found this discussion about interdisciplinary work very interesting. That has just started. And I think COVID-19, of course, is a very good example for the need of interdisciplinary work. Other examples would be climate change. I think if we really want to talk about climate change and how to cope with it, we also need, of course, the collaboration of people, of scientists and scholars from other fields. So what do you think, what does it need? What does it need to support this interdisciplinary work? Is it first of all that scholars have to rethink about their own agenda and about their methods? Or is it rather politics and grants that are given that play an important role? Where do you see the most important factors for supporting more interdisciplinary research?
Perhaps we collect another question, if there's one. Yes. Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Leila Rekhuyashvili, working at EFL. I just wanted to link up as the climate change was mentioned. I was just thinking if you've been thinking about the fact that Corona might indeed be the first test case in responding major global crisis, and whether there is already research on the way that would have this kind of future-looking perspective in terms of, and indeed beyond authoritarian versus democratic states, that would be looking into what kind of systems can handle this global scale major displacing crisis, and whether we could look at Corona from this perspective that more crises are on our doors.
Would there be a third one, perhaps, a third question? Otherwise, we cannot. Perhaps you can answer. Who wants to start?
You are the optimist about interdisciplinarity.
Okay, absolutely.
I should have said it the way Gwendolyn has said it. That's much better. But you are on our advisory board, so I'm just learning.
No, you made it easy for me to put this forward. Well, I think that's always the key question. What does it need more of? I think it needs all of what you mentioned. But I think the key thing I would emphasize is that we need means and places to create structures within which this is possible. No? So I think it's not so difficult to make individual scholars realize that there are, first of all, limits to their own approaches and methods, but also interesting things from someone else in some other discipline. But to integrate that into projects that are feasible, supported, and that will also take probably, I would assume, longer, because one has to learn a lot more along the way. So that is all not so conducive, as I mentioned before, for an individual's academic career. So at the moment, it seems to me that interdisciplinarity you can afford if you are an established academic, and then you can dabble in interdisciplinarity in a way. But it shouldn't really be like that, no? So I think it needs. So that's why I would, I think, put the emphasis on creating structures within this is actually possible and valued, and given the time and space it needs. But it needs all the other aspects too, and it also starts with individuals, and not everybody will even be interested in engaging in someone else's methods. Well, I'm just trying to understand them, not even engaging in them.
Matthias, do you want to answer the question about the climate because we're in the test phase for climate change?
Yeah, I mean, this is the one issue where I find this crisis so interesting. We don't know how the world order of the future will look like. But what we can conclude from the very few months we have gone through is that obviously regionalism has a point. So when you look into the action of the African Union, they were the first to give up national sovereignty's priority in order to face the challenge, because they were very much aware that individual states have not the means to fight that pandemic. And they were also very conscious about the fact that there are many other crises at the same time, so HIV and so on and so on. The European Union took a little bit longer to overcome its border closing tendencies, but in the end, everyone understood that this crisis is too big for individual national economies, etc., etc. We don't know if and how the European Union will act in the future. Interestingly enough, Trump seems to have understood that as well, by now spreading his arms into Latin America again. Something we know from 1823 Monroe Doctrine, and then from the many, many interactions between the Americas in the 1950s and so on. Yeah, so the famous fruit company and all this. If this is all nice and to celebrate is a completely different question. So that's one. Second, it seems that multilateralism, rule-based multilateralism, is in a deep crisis. The question is, what are the conclusions out of that sentence? Particularly for a country like Germany that bases its ideological behavior in international relations very much on that principle, but seems to lose a little bit partners for that action. So what comes then next? Some American scholars speculate about two powers directing the world, others see three. Some would say no, perhaps we have G20, etc. So we have a very chaotic situation when we only look into political organizations. Let's take now the transnational companies and so on and so on and so on. I guess that will be the task for the next 4 to 10 years, to elaborate on our new experiences with the world order that is just emerging. And then the question of interdisciplinarity is how to apply that to fields that are seen from the natural science and the life science in a very universalistic ways. So their idea about climate change is to attack this problem with worldwide action. And how these two insights fit together. The world becomes fragmented, chaotic, full of short-term alliances, And then someone who says we have to act as humanity in a very coherent way. And here you could do something with interdisciplinarity. And I would say the condition to answer that question is it should be a shame not to have read what your colleagues have written.
Thank you. I think we have a last question here, and I would like to ask Stefan to answer it. Where's the mic? I mean.
Thank you. I'm Judith Pallot, University of Oxford and the University of Helsinki. I'm asking a question from the standpoint of what we study, or what our brief is in the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies. All of you have been talking very much at a global level and responses to this global pandemic. My question is, do you think that the pandemic and COVID and the responses are going to have an impact, or likely to have an impact, on how we understand Russian and East European and Eurasian area studies? Or are you saying that, okay, the coherence that there might have been, and I know that this is arguable, in Russian, Eurasian and East European studies up to this point has been smashed and torn apart by COVID? It really is resetting the agenda.
I think that's connecting several questions, or brings it to the point of the reason of this gathering again. Well, there were several other epidemics. There was SARS, there was Ebola, and these were South Asian, Chinese, or then African phenomena. Actually, now it's the first time that Europe, after HIV, and the Western world, if you like this, including Eastern Europe, Russia, is involved in a global pandemic. And for example, the discussion about the culture of wearing masks was denounced at the beginning in Germany and Central Europe as being something which is impossible for our culture because of the Renaissance, etc. We are not able to wear masks. There were such articles in the newspapers. This is now the past again already. How does it fit to your question? Well, it's just 6 months ago that it started, and how will it look in 2 years? Is it then again evaporated? If it has a lasting effect, then one could try to see if some modes of answering troubles from the second half of the 20th century or from the 1990s can be found in these political systems, in the Russian political system, or in the Belarusian, in the Ukrainian, in the Polish or the Hungarian political system. But we should of course be not seeing it in a container of Eastern Europe. This would be disastrous. Again, of course, it's a globalized situation. Every system has the ability to react in another way, and these systems are interconnected. So even without this situation, we have been starting to talk on a global level, and we will continue to do this. This is, I think, no question. So the answer will be probably no, it doesn't change so much after all. And the situation is a global situation, and you have in every continent several modes of answering. You have, and it doesn't make sense to see these answers as leading to structures which will be persistent for the next 20 years. I'm very doubtful of this. I think in 2 or in 5 years, there will not be an Eastern European structure having evolved, and not a Central Eastern European, and not an Eastern or Eastern European in the smaller sense. I think it will be difficult to map the world on the grounds of COVID-19, if not impossible, no, yeah, rather impossible.
You want to add? Okay, but then we have to come to the end.
I know it's a big question. It's a wonderful question to think about. I mean, I think we had moved quite far from thinking of that vast region as one. But I think nevertheless, and I think that's what your question was getting at, I don't think that's going to change, and we know that there's so much variation within that region, and we see that today in the response to COVID as well. But I think nevertheless, there will be also new similarities emerging between parts of, or maybe parts of countries will look more similar again within a certain region than they might have for the last sort of 2 decades. And in particular, if we think of what's happening to the economies in the whole area. So we've talked more about the political system and how strong the state is and those things so far. But if we think of that, and it rolls back a lot of the development on small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, so the challenges, very different systems across the region will now share in a way how to rebuild this, and not having the reserves to support the system like many West European countries do, I think raises interesting questions then, again, from an academic point of view, that we might also see more similarities again than we have seen for the last maybe 2 decades.
Matthias.
Your question reminded me of a joke I learned at school. The Elbe dries out. What happened? The Chinese People's Army fills its water tanks. Meaning we are a very, very small part of this Eurasian landmass. And when we turn into climate change and all the research about resilience, our society's resilience, we become aware again that this Eastern Europe is not only about political regimes and about energy supply, etc., but it is also about an enormous landmass with all its challenges when it, for example, will defreeze. Yeah, what will happen to our cities when the tundra is no longer this hold of CO2? So I guess this kind of research can be inspired by this turn into the question of about resilience of societies. Here I would be more optimistic that this will remain. There is now debate about how to build smart cities when it is coming up with more heat. We speak about where to do our vacation when all these places are so burning. So it is very close to our life experience, and there I would say society will ask us for answers, and perhaps also the Eastern Europeanists.
Yeah, thank you very much. We came to the end of this first round, and I think we see already that this event is like an appetizer for the conference, because there are huge questions which we can really just tackle a little bit, but not really go into the depth. And we have a second round now, 15 minutes pause, and then we have more practical impacts which will be discussed. So thank you very much, and see you later. So, ladies and gentlemen, after a small pause, we go on with the more practical impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on research and academic work. And I'm very happy that we have, again, very competent and nice speakers here at the panel, and I will introduce you to them. It's Gabriele Freitag in the middle. She's the managing director of the German Association for Eastern European Studies, DGO, in Berlin. And the DGO is the largest network of academics in Germany engaged in research on East European affairs, and it has a very well-respected journal called Osteuropa, Eastern Europe. And Gabi is as well the General Secretary of the International Council for Central and East European Studies. Then we have here to my right Judith Pallot. She is Emeritus Professor of Geography in Oxford, an active member of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies, and also on the editorial board of Eurasian Geography. And she has a research project. She will tell us about it, very interesting. It's actually launched at the Helsinki University. It's on prison administration in Russia. Then here next to me, it's Réka Krizmanics. She is defending her PhD in comparative history next month, and she comes originally from Hungary. She did her master there in nationalism studies at the Central European University in Budapest, which had to changed its place to Vienna, as we all know, and currently she is a lecturer at the University of Leipzig and also a teaching fellow for the Global History Lab at Princeton University in the US, and she will also tell us about her experience. And I will start with Gabi, because I remember very well myself that I think it was in March that I went to a big conference in Hamburg, which was actually the annual conference of the DGO, a very interesting topic, and we were already keeping a little bit distant because of COVID-19, but it was still actually there, and I remember it so well because it was my last conference for a long, long time, and I could imagine that you felt into a deep hole or something afterwards, because it was actually quite quickly that you couldn't do any traveling anymore or conferences, or how was it actually?
The interesting thing is I can't even say that COVID-19 came as a shock to us, because I think it took us several weeks to realize to what extent our work would change. Since in the beginning we just delayed some of our conferences or workshops or panel discussions, thinking that we would organize them within 2 months or 3 months. So we then, at a board meeting, finally decided that for the whole year we would not do any real events as we did before, but rather, if so, then hybrid events like the one that we have here today. So it took us some time to learn what it means. But what is interesting, I mean, we of course were not the only ones, and now looking back at the last months, last 5-6 months, I really can see quite well the pros and cons, also the advantages of what we have been coping with.
Which are the advantages, actually?
DGO mainly is a network. What we do is organize communication of scholars from various disciplines. But our focus, and I think this is different, our work in this respect is different to the work of BASIS, because we also work at the interface between academia and the general public, which means we also reach out to people from politics, economy, media, NGOs, whose work is related to Eastern Europe as well. So we organize academic discussions, but we also organize the exchange between academia and other spheres. And so we do organize a lot of events. And there has been a lot of talk on Belarus right now. And I think so Belarus might serve as a good example. We were able to organize a 4-part series of discussions very quickly after the protests started. So 4 separate events, inviting people also from Belarus, from Russia, from Finland. And of course, they could all join us because all events were online, Zoom. Also, we could reach out in a way to a broader public, because most of our events are Berlin-based, since we have our office in Berlin. So we get a lot of positive feedback from our members and also from other people who say, it's so nice, I do live in Frankfurt, I do live in Zurich, and now I have the opportunity to join your events. So we invited people who otherwise would not have been able from Belarus to come to Berlin right now. And we reached out to a broader audience. And this, I think, really is an advantage. And this is something that we should work on further, I think. But especially if we take Belarus, people do attend these discussions, not only to get information. A lot of them are really involved. So what is lacking now is to have a platform where people really can discuss, where can they also exchange their emotions. There has been talk about emotions, and I think emotions are very important also in the sphere of academia. So I think there is a certain need for people to discuss what is going on in Belarus, and also maybe to discuss
what can we do about it? And this is something that I really feel is lacking at the moment. So here you have the pros and cons, taking Belarus as an example, and how we cover what's going on there now.
Yeah, thank you. Réka, I would like to go on with you. You were perhaps lucky that you finished your dissertation already, in this time, and now you still have to defend it, but you, as a lecturer, I could imagine that you really had hard times, because that's what I hear from my own children studying and people around, how difficult it is actually to lecture now, and especially with people who start university. Could you share your experiences with that, with us?
Yes, I also think that would lead us very far if I'd go on, about the general challenges of postgrads. So just sticking to the teaching in COVID circumstances, first of all, I would really make a distinction between the management of online transition in a setting where there's no tradition, no methodological preparation for it, which happened to most of the European universities with COVID. And there was also an already growing but still marginal sector where online learning was already something in development for the sole purpose of being delivered online to an audience. So obviously a lot of improvisation and a lot of flexibility was needed from lecturers who needed to do the transition from the offline setting to the online setting with a bit of an exaggeration overnight. But I think that we already have in all different academic settings now at least one semester of good practices behind us, and this is really something that needs to be treated strategically. So this should not stay in those staff meetings that were held every second week, exchanging experiences. There should be a very systematic reflection on this experience, and I think also a dialogue needs to be opened towards the online teaching systems, and I'm both talking about those scholars who are working on the methodology of online teaching and the technical departments, because I think that technical literacy alone would not solve the issue of those teachers who are used to the on-site teaching environment. So
there's some simple lessons, where you would say there are differences. With people, as from what I understood in this project you're in from Princeton, you're actually in an online project, which has been designed like this. And,
yes.
And on the other hand, you see in Leipzig that you need to be a lecturer under some improvised conditions. So are there actually some I don't know, lessons you could tell us already?
Yes, and then I would also have a question at the end. So I think that maybe the crucial issue is attention span, and being aware of how different attention spans towards different communications of content can be. So I did have a very short training before I started my fellowship, headed by Princeton University, but this is a network, really, where we could see how the different kinds of contents, audiovisual content, textual content, and face-to-face content are measuring up in relation to each other, how they are following each other in a very easily perceptible way. So how they are actually trying to manage just very tiny things. I think one of the immediate techniques that came into mind transitioning from the on-site teaching to online teaching was to have simply Zoom meetings or using whatever platform for having an online seminar. This happened very often. So simply breaking down these sessions into shorter sessions, or making sure that smaller groups of students have the possibility to discuss some things, for example, in so-called breakout rooms, so that we are creating smaller spaces of discussion where the lecturer is always jumping in, checking in whether meaningful work is going on there, could be much more efficient than, let's say, trying to deliver a lecture real time to an audience of 20 students real time. So this is maybe something. Or it was also a very frequent response, I think, that professors recorded their lectures, so that they wanted to make sure that regardless of internet connection issues and simply how different people were able to manage the COVID situation, they want to make their content available, the most important, the core issues available in a single lecture. We could say that, sure, if one wants to dedicate a given amount of time to listen to that specific lecture, then they can sort of break up the lectures in a way they want to. But this is really usually not what is happening, but it's more like scrolling and speeding up the lecture, and then parts of are going to be missing. And of course, there is like no foolproof way to prevent this. But for example, if the lecturer very consciously composes the lecture in a way that it is meaningful to break it up into smaller segments, and it is also uploaded in smaller segments, usually the turnout is much better at the end. Mm-hmm. So these would be the very sort of specific.
Thank you. Would it be okay that I take Judith first and your question will be later? Or?
Maybe later, yes.
Yeah? Okay, fine. So Judith, the European Research Council has provided a grant of nearly 2.5 million euro, from what I saw, for your project on Russian prisons, and it's also for 5 years. And so I would be interested, what does the corona pandemic mean for a project like this, which lives on empirical research? I mean, you need people to go into prisons. So what are you doing now?
Yes, I would want to preface what I'm saying by sort of observing what the gasp from the audience conveyed, which is that there aren't many grants in Russian and East European area studies of this size. Yeah. So whatever I'm saying about the difficulties that COVID has created for my research are certainly mitigated by both the time of the research I have, 5 years, and I'm only in the second year of it, and the resources that I can deploy to get myself out of the difficult, or get us out of the difficult situation that COVID's put us in. But in talking about that, I would want to be underlying just how difficult it is for those people who haven't got that time and haven't got those resources, because a lot of my the reconfiguration I've done of the research and the sort of alternative ways of collecting data that I've been able to use depend on the size of the grant and the time I have to do it. So to get to your question, so just to preface what I'm saying with that, the way it's my research is a difficult area. It's interviews with vulnerable subjects in closed institutions. And so one of the obvious things that happened immediately with COVID was that those carefully negotiated over a period of a year access to Georgian prisons to do interviews, and Romanian prisons to do interviews, plus the subcontracts are negotiated with Russian researchers to do interviews with former prisoners, because we can't get into Russian prisons at the moment, just collapsed. That all became absolutely impossible. And so I had to find an alternative series of ways of collecting data. But again, one thing I would say is that this in research is a fairly common problem, because effectively what's happened is that I've lost access to the field. I'm not the first researcher doing postdoctoral and further research or doctoral research who's lost access to the field. It's a fairly common problem. and especially in the global south, and especially in Russian and East European studies, or Soviet and East European studies. So it's something that people in our area should be used to, and should already, I think, when they're putting together grants and putting together projects, grant applications and projects, should always have fallback positions, and should always think, what am I going to do if I don't get permission to go and do this, that, or the other, or if I don't get sort of access to this archive, because this is a common feature that goes right back to when I started back in the 1970s. You know, so I have to say, within my grant, I'd already built in lots of fallback positions. So what do I do? Instead of interviewing prisoners, I'll interview former prisoners. Because I don't think we'll get back into prisons. You know, no prisoner is going to want any outside researcher going in and seeing how they dealt with COVID, which on the whole they didn't deal very well, and lots of human rights violations. So, we switched in that way, and we switched countries. Estonia. Everything's going to be generalised from Estonia now, because from Finland you can get to Estonia. You know, I just come back from interviewing former prisoners in Estonia. I've been able to use my resources to subcontract onshore researchers to do my interviews for me, and so on and so forth. So there are all these things that I'm able to do, but that you're not able to do, I think, unless because you haven't got the resources.
You spoke about a generation gap actually before, where we had a little round. So
yes.
Would that be something you
well, anybody of my generation, one or two who are perhaps approaching it, well, anybody who remembers back to 1989, 1991, no doubt will have been struck by some of the similarities, you know, suddenly, and it really was overnight. People's research was, you know, especially those poor souls who had just finished their book on the stability of the Soviet political system, and we all know some of them, and some of them never recovered from it. You know, this is rather similar to that. Not in quite the same way, but I'm just thinking you're very lucky that you've just finished your thesis. The people, the graduates, the postgraduates, I feel very sorry for, and the early career researchers, is those who have done, you know, who are halfway through their field work. You know, what can they do? Can they get the resources from their funder, their university, to you know, employ other people to do their research for them? It's not so easy. So then what you have to do is start thinking, well, of alternative ways of doing interviews, and that's when you get into Skype, Zoom, and there have been a lot of discussions amongst the anthropologists and sociologists about how doing a Skype or a Zoom interview is nearly as good as doing a face-to-face interview, you know, and there'll be whole papers devoted to that. But as you know, that this actually raises a whole series of different methodological and ethical questions that people, I think, haven't even begun to think seriously about in Russian and East European area studies. And especially if they're doing the sort of research that I do with vulnerable subjects, how do you ensure confidentiality? How can you ensure confidentiality when you're using Zoom or Skype? Because we do not know what access third parties have to these. So you know, my advice would be to people who are saying, okay, instead of going and interviewing people in person, face to face, I'll do it on Skype or Zoom or by telephone, is, hey, hang on a minute, stop, you've got to think about the ethics of this. If you've already got ethical approval for a project that's doing face-to-face interviews from your university, you must go back to your university ethics committee and reapply for using this different methodology. You know, there are some very, very serious implications. And that's before we get on to the general data protection regulations, which concern the movement of data, both if it's within the EU, fine, not too bad. If it's from a non-EU country into the EU, you know, this is a very, very tricky area, that, COVID and the lack of access to the field in the way that we might have been expecting to get access to the field has changed, and that one's got to rethink about. So sorry to sound gloomy about it. There are ways of doing it, but I would caution just going into alternative methods of data collection without thinking very seriously about the ethical and logistical problems of it. I'm sorry, did I answer your question? I don't think I did.
No, that's fine, that's fine. But Gabi, I would like to focus a little bit more about this question of young academics, because the DGO has also a lot of programs actually for young people and networking and so on. And so are there some things you were thinking about, what there is to be done to help young academics, especially now? And are you lobbying perhaps somewhere to get longer term, I don't know, scholarships or whatever? I mean,
no, the thing is, interestingly enough, we discussed this question this morning because we have a section for young scholars called Junge DGO, Young DGO. So we had an organizational meeting, and of course via Zoom this morning, where we mainly discussed organizational questions. So in the end I said I would attend this discussion tonight. And so I asked them, what do they think, and do they think that we have for different generations of academics different experiences now? So what they said on the one hand is that they feel that of course elder scholars are more hesitant with using online tools. This is one thing. So that you have, as you already said, it is important in a way to already have some experience in using online tools. So this is one problem, and I suppose in Germany this goes for nearly all people who teach at universities, that there is hardly any knowledge. But on the other hand, they also said that it requires a lot of self-organization. So if you take really young students, it takes a lot for them to do this online teaching. I mean, to be in a class, to be in an online class, because it really requires that you organize your work very independently. And this is another problem that they see. And then, of course, but this is something we might talk about later on, it is also the danger that since COVID-19 and using online tools also has a lot of advantages, that we might face the problem of our governments now thinking that this is a good chance of economizing, and which also might mean that there will be less, I don't know, that might mean that there might be less money for education and for teaching, and this also might have an influence on jobs for young scholars. But this is maybe something we can talk about later on.
Réka, what do you think about
this?
Yes,
I at some point I also hoped that this is going to come up, because I think that the pushback against onlineization is completely understandable from this point of view, and I don't think that in these terms there would be a sort of a generational divide where young scholars would be like flocking under the banners of having more online, and then from the senior faculty there would be a pushback. No, I think these fears are really well established, and the US is a very good example in many ways that online teaching in a way can take away jobs in higher education. And those departments, I can only speak for the US context, so those departments which are really hardly hit by, which are really heavily hit by it are usually the otherwise shrinking arts and humanities departments and liberal colleges.
So
anyway.
also Eastern Europe studies, or?
Including these, I mean, the very specific examples I am aware of are more general sort of big humanities departments where you would have maybe a philologist who is specialized in one of the Slavic languages, and then if the department goes, then the given person also needs to go, and also there would be a broader implication of is a professor and their human and intellectual capacities replaceable. And I think this would again bring us back to these broader ethical questions that are just about to emerge or re-emerge, and which really need to be seriously thought about. I mean, I do hope that there's an obvious answer for this question, but we do have to have solid arguments for it and be able, for example, to defend it against such governmental intentions, if they do exist already.
But still in Germany, I mean, most of the universities are state-funded. I mean, we have private universities, and my feeling is that they have much more problems now with COVID-19, especially if they have a lot of foreign students who are not willing to pay anymore if they can't enter the country. So tell us about Great Britain. From what I read, I mean, there's this double effect of Brexit and COVID-19. So
I prefer not to talk about what's going on in the UK at the moment.
No, but in the university and the academic, I mean...
Well, would it's all bad do? I mean, no. Of course, you know what's happening. I think it's part of these universal trends, but it's just exaggerated, and it's going to be with Brexit, because already before COVID, we were worrying about you know the movement of scholars at all different levels into the UK, and COVID has just you know made that even worse. So I don't see anything good. But I would really like to bring the discussion, if possible, back to Russian and East European area studies, because, and it goes back to the same question I was asking earlier, is there anything particularly that is affecting us? And I think that the answer to that is very much yes, because one of the things about area studies is that we tend to study other places from the ones we're in. Now, it's less like that now than it was during the era of Soviet and East European studies, when it was people from the West going to Eastern Europe and to the Soviet Union and trying to do their research there. But there's still this idea within area studies that we're interested in place. We're interested in how place has a bearing on you know, what we're interested in examining at the present time. And so not to have access to place is terribly important in I think, area studies and in what we're all engaged in both in teaching and in research. And so I think we have, you know, potentially this is very, very damaging, and all of those possible consequences that would be, you know, the lack of funding by our universities to go and look at other places, be in other places, do our research in other places, which has obviously affected all disciplines, but I think us in particular. And of course, where the you know, language is really important. I don't know whether this is the case in Germany, but you know, if you're going to study Russia, you have to speak Russian. If you're going to study Czechia, you better speak Czech. And one of the good ways of doing that is actually going to those countries and not to be able to. It cannot be substituted by this being done online. And so, and I think that's really what has brought home, this COVID has brought home to us, is, you know, when we find that we can't go to the area in which we're studying, even if we can get all the data online, even if the archives are now all being digitized. Actually, I must admit, this is one of my discussions I have with historians. I cannot understand how historians can study an area sitting in an archive and not need to go there. But this is a particular thing I find difficult to understand about historians, as well as the way they draw their maps, which is in their books. So those are the two things. But you know, I think this is really important, and that is what I think for us is the issue. Is sort of.
So, but may I ask, since area studies are very often under pressure, do you see a chance or a danger in it? I mean, the danger might be, okay, we can do, so from the outside academia, let's say, because even within the academic field, you see that area studies are very often under pressure, and to explain why they are important and why it needs people to go to the places. So do you see that the current situation is rather a danger, with people thinking, well, as long as you have Zoom and can at least discuss online with people, you don't really have to go there? Or do you see on the other side that there is a chance for area studies now to show that it is really important to be on the spot?
I think this goes back to which institution we're having that conversation with. So it was something that was said in the earlier session, is that the way universities are constructed and the disciplines are, the historical disciplines exist in universities, inhibits interdisciplinarity, which is, area studies is interdisciplinary, if nothing else. So there's an argument that's going on with universities, which is different from what governments are asking for and what the research councils are asking for. Because I don't know, it's certainly the case in the UK funding councils, and it's also the case with the ERC, that the two boxes you have to tick and you have to show are that you are interdisciplinary and what's the other one? Well, yes, sort of area studies, international, intercultural. Yet the problem is that doesn't translate into universities. So the answer to your question is, I would want to know to whom am I trying to make that case. Is there an opportunity? I'm going to be very optimistic here and say yes, if we're prepared to grasp it and come forward and make that case and argue about the importance of place, of engagement with the cultures we're examining, and that this is of vital importance. Of course it is, but we've got to be prepared. I think area studies can come forward and argue that. Having said that, the attempt certainly that I've been engaged in when I was before Matthias took over as president of BASIS, with various of the, for example, Humanities Funding Council or the Social Studies Funding Councils in the UK, to try to impress upon them the importance of language, of social scientists, historians, people who aren't in modern language departments, acquiring foreign languages, sort of falls on deaf ears. Something you have to learn Russian in evening school.
Réka, do you want to add to this discussion something?
I think I could quite neatly tie my earlier question into this, and this would be really a big open question. So what do you think after COVID, or after there seems to be a moment when the world is coming up for air, is there going to be a kind of a systemic reaction and incorporation of this COVID experience into how funds are being, or fund applications are being evaluated? For example, is it going to be a requirement that in risk management everyone includes who might want to involve fieldwork, that health risks, pandemics, what would be the answer for that? So just to go to the very, very practical level of things. Or with the faculties, those faculties which don't have this tradition of online teaching, will they actually have contingency plans which will build on something like a series of trainings that tries to make scholars literate in online tools, even though they might be able to deliver the lectures on site?
Perhaps you both could answer, but not so long, because we have also questions from the chat and from the audience.
I think the quick answer to that question is actually going back to what I said at the beginning. Nobody should be putting in an application for research funding without, certainly in our area, possibly not in East Central European countries now, although I can think of a couple where it's advisable. But certainly if you're doing research in Russia or Central Asia or one of those, you should always have had fallback positions. You always had to, if you want to get the grant, shown that this can genuinely be be done. I mean, what as I was saying earlier, I've been amazed at one of the recent sets of applications for a position I was looking at from some young scholars, where they their research projects were to do field work in Bulgaria or whatever with these or that subjects, as if COVID hadn't happened. I think that our work is going to change, and I think that it would be inadvisable, I think, at the moment to say I'm going to do research in such and such an area over the next couple of years. I think we're going to rely more, which is good and positive, on, and it goes back to what we were saying before, and I hope that they get the funds for it, for the onshore, for the people coming from those cultures. But that is raising lots of interesting questions about research by the sort of indigenous researchers and outsiders. Area studies has tended, historically, to be the outside view. But I do think that, a lot of the research now that will have to be supported is going to be by people who are in those countries and in the higher education institutions in those countries. I think that's a good thing.
Gabi, you want to add?
No, there's nothing to add from my side, but it's a very interesting thought, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. Because we have an interesting question actually from the chat, and I will read it to you. How much will COVID-19 affect research with regard to giving priority to COVID-19 topics, ignoring other research topics? Réka, do you want to answer this? Or do we have the feeling that there is like a fashion of COVID-19 topics now?
I think maybe this could be easier, could be answered easier by a natural scientist or a life scientist. But as we already heard it in the first panel, obviously there are very severe implications for the social sciences as well on COVID or onto COVID as an experience, basically. So on the short term, I think most of the big grants really require years of preparation. So by the time these sort of very complicated applications would be put together, we might, would see the after COVID period. But I mean, I would not really venture into guesses exactly because I think none of us could safely bet on whether this pandemic or this sense of impending doom is going to stay with us, at least in the midterm, or not.
Do you agree?
I'm not sure that I agree with you. I think it's already had an impact, and I think it's bound to on the research funding councils. Because especially, as one has to, so much research now is about answering the problems, the immediate problems of the day. I can't see how there's not going to be some.
But I think the
prioritise.
question was
I must admit, everybody I'm talking to, I say put in COVID, add some COVID in there.
I think that it needs wise grant giving at this. Yeah. So because of course there are certain criteria that will have to be taken into account, and I suppose there will be quite a lot of research on effects of COVID. But of course the danger would be if you give too much money to COVID projects now and disregard other topics. Yeah. So I think what would rather be important is, I think what Gwendolyn already mentioned in the first panel, is that there are certain criteria that you will have to integrate into research questions, maybe. Criteria that come up with regard to COVID. Mm-hmm.
I would like to take some questions here from the, please. Matthias, and then.
Only one remark. There was a call for applications by Volkswagen.
Do we need the mic, actually? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. COVID-19 issues in the social science and humanities, 1,100 applications. Yeah. And I guess it is end of September that there is the German Research Council waiting for another thousands of applications in a special program on COVID-19. I would say there is a certain opportunism to turn everything into COVID-19-like stories. But my question is a different one. I can't confirm this end of fieldwork story. In our university here in Leipzig, the rector has to authorize each travel to a foreign country. And you have always to argue in favor of the young researcher applying for such a thing. And I write my fingers bloody in writing letters that this fieldwork is necessary and the people travel like hell. Meaning...
You mean at the moment?
To turn it into a question, what is the narrative? Is the narrative we had a sharp interruption of any opportunity to do fieldwork, but we recover soon? Because we have established over the last 20 years a standard that without fieldwork there is no valid research any longer in transnational, transregional, global, whatever it is, social sciences, history, or so. Or do we fall back into 100 years tradition to do armchairs research? Because that is much easier to do, less costly, and the books, are read as the others are. So the point is, for which story do we decide? And I hear Gabi's argument, which I read very, very often by German professors. There is the danger. They will cut resources. This government will cut resources. Or do we describe the danger until politics take the message that there is no fieldwork necessary?
So I would ask back, whose standard is it that it requires fieldwork to do good research? Isn't it the standard of people who are engaged in area studies?
Whenever you look for applications for jobs, recruitments now in what kind of history, you can't get anyone who has no experience with languages, fieldwork, and archival work, not only at home, so metropolis studies also.
And you think it would be the same with social sciences?
Parts of social science is the same, yeah.
So, Judith, what do you think?
I wasn't sure what the question was, actually.
But what's the narrative?
What's the narrative?
Or is it a trend back to the good old practice without fieldwork?
Well, it was the good old practice that I was just wondering about. If you were doing, in your early years, all that sitting in the armchair, you could jolly well have read my books. But that's a different point. What's the narrative? I'm not really sure what the narrative is yet, but the narrative might be that, yes, that is up for discussion. I was thinking specifically within Russian and East European area studies, where fieldwork has really been so very important. And I think the narrative there is that actually some of the research that has been funded for people like myself to go in and look at the Russian prison service really should be funded for Russian people to look at the Russian prison service, if only they would take an interest in it. So I think the narrative in area studies is rather different from the, might end up being rather different from that narrative. Maybe the armchairs should be left for the people towards the end of their careers.
Oh, yeah.
And the youngest one. But no, I mean, if you're saying, and I think I would agree with you, that there's been, there has been among, with young researchers, perhaps, more international travel and things that are called field work than might be absolutely necessary given the research topics they're doing. So sometimes, when you're talking with young, I'm thinking more sort of master's students talking about their topics, they're driven by wanting to go to a particular place rather than what is the intriguing intellectual question that I want to investigate, which might keep me here. But I do have to say, as a sort of potential supervisor, my heart would always sink when somebody came along saying they wanted to look at office development in Leicester, compared with somebody who said that they wanted to go to, Africa. But there are lots of other sort of questions. I think there are lots of question marks over field work from Western academic institutions that began long before COVID, which are to do with the colonial gaze, you know, sort of...
I think that's a discussion on its own. And
that's a different discussion, yes. But I think that the narrative is up for debate, and COVID might have indeed, you know, pushed it up the agenda.
There was another question which I would take like a last question.
Thank you. It was very much related to Matthias' question from just now. It was rather into the direction of methodological skills, because you were talking so much about the value of contingency plans and the value of being able to switch in case of necessity, but still it's not the same. So you won't ask the same questions and you won't get the same results. And you would also, well, perhaps even lose the skills of doing things in terms of participant observation, in terms of interviews. And isn't there basically this, if it were to last, kind of a danger of basically losing the ability, losing the methodological capacities, relying on those, well, very laudable contingency plans that are around?
They're not, but again, I go back to this is what every good researcher should always be doing anyway. And yes, of course, you're absolutely right that it often involves, you know, having to develop new skills, develop, change the methodology that you were planning to use. But that's what happens in somebody's research career. You know, that is what research is about, is to be able to respond to changes as they occur. And that is something that people should be prepared to do. I want to give you an example of a thesis I examined recently by somebody who wanted to do some research in a male institution, happened to be a prison in male institutions, was not given permission to do that. You know, this is what I was saying, loss of access to the field, not being able to do what you wanted to do, common in research, especially in our area. So this person did it in an all-female institution instead, but hadn't read anything about gender. You know, you have to do that. Or you say, well, I'm not going to do research. I mean, I just think it's part, you then have to shift and you have to learn a new method. But really, giant shifts aren't, actually they are in the case of the US, as the USSR. We used to do this very frequently. And the other thing, you'd say was choose your research topic sensibly when you're setting out at the beginning. Is don't be so sort of over-ambitious. Actually be prepared to work within the then parameters. You know. But that doesn't really answer your question. Other people might disagree with me, but it's
and before we come to the end, do you think as well, you both, that we lose abilities, or are there also chances now to learn something which we could actually use even when COVID-19 is gone? I mean,
I think the question implied that there could be gains, and it's more about the losses, if I understood it correctly, concern about the losses. Mm-hmm. And yeah, but I also think that Judith also acknowledged it, that yes, losses might occur on the way, and it's terribly scary because a lot of investment, for example, into learning a language, it can get stale. We do know what happens with a language skill that is not being practiced enough, but this can happen to using specific methodologies as well. I think that's a real issue.
I mean, one example, a historical example, because we've not talked about access to archives, which is very important. A lot of stuff has been digitized, but a lot of archives haven't been. But if you think of people like Steve Barnes, he did his wonderful book on the Gulag in Karlag. Everybody at the time thought all the regional archives were going to open up. We were going to all be able to do that Gulag research. Of course, they closed down. He can't get back into Karlag. And so somebody like Paul Wilson-Bell, who was expecting to get into the Novosibirsk archive for his PhD work, couldn't get there. So he had to shift and look for different sources and use those sources in different ways. You know, that is, I think if you if you're not prepared to make those shifts, you should, do your thesis on office development in Leicester.
Gabi, perhaps the last sentence, which
Yes,
is also,
I suppose that we will not go back to business as usual. I think that COVID really will affect academic research, also communication, etc. And I think the most important thing is to realize that we at least have the ability to shape the way to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So we are not just victims who are now affected by COVID-19. So I think it is our job now to see where are the dangers, where are the chances, and that we should really take the chances that there are.
yeah. I think that's a very nice closing remark for this session. And I think we're also in the middle ourselves of an experiment, because if I think some month ago we thought it wouldn't be possible to sit like this, to have discussions like this, a hybrid format. And I think we're learning with the developments to cope and to live in this new normal. And I'm very optimistic that we will meet again here in April, having a kind of conference, whatever this will be, I mean, in terms of hybrid format. And it's planned to be from the 21st to the 24th of April next year, and I hope to see you then again. And thank you very much to you, to my speakers, especially to the technicians there, to the organizers, and have a nice evening. Thank you very much.